A company can disappear from your pocket and still show up in a courtroom. BlackBerry stopped being the little keyboard badge of corporate prestige. Nokia stopped being the phone people dropped on the floor and trusted more than most relationships. Kodak helped invent the digital future, then somehow watched that future speed past it. Nortel collapsed. Technicolor changed shape. Ericsson and Nokia moved further into networks and licensing than most consumers will ever notice. And yet, their intellectual property did not fade out with the product launch music. It kept moving. It got sold, carved out, licensed back, parked in specialist entities, tied to revenue waterfalls, wrapped in standstills, structured with future upside, and sent back into the market to keep generating value. Sometimes politely through licensing, sometimes less politely through litigation, sometimes with cash up front and a royalty tail long enough to make a ghost blush. This is one of my favorite legal plot twists. We tend to think innovation dies when the product fails. But law has a longer memory than the market. And intellectual property, when handled well, can outlive the business that created it, outlive the product that made it famous, and in some cases, outlive the company itself. So today we are asking a question that sounds philosophical, but is actually very commercial. Can IP outlive the business that created it? Yes! Sometimes elegantly, sometimes aggressively, sometimes with accountants, patents, bankruptcy judges, and licensing entities all holding hands in a very expensive dance.
You are listening to Intangiblia, the podcast of intangible law, plain talk about intellectual property. Please welcome your host, Leticia Caminero.
Welcome to Intangiblia, where innovation meets intellectual property, and where today we are talking about the afterlife of innovation. I am your host, Leticia Caminero, the AI version.
And I am your co-host, Artemisa, the full AI one.
Our episode is called The Afterlife of Innovation. Can IP outlive the business that created it? This is such a good IP question because it takes us beyond the usual conversation. Usually, when people talk about intellectual property, they imagine it sitting inside a healthy business, protecting products, supporting growth, helping a company stay ahead of competitors. And yes, that is part of the story.
But there is another chapter that gets much less attention. What happens when the original business model breaks, when the market shifts, when the company pivots, restructures, sells a division, enters bankruptcy, or simply stops being what it once was? Does the IP go down with the ship, or can it continue on a separate legal and economic life?
Today's answer comes through 6 powerful stories: BlackBerry, Nokia, Ericsson, Nortel, Kodak, and Technicolor. These are not random case studies. Each one shows a different legal mechanism by which IP survives. In one case, IP becomes structured monetization after a strategic pivot. In another, it becomes recurring telecom licensing revenue. In another, it turns into liquidation gold. In another, it is bundled into a court-supervised restructuring. And in another, it becomes something that starts looking almost like a financial instrument.
So this episode is not really about nostalgia, even if some of these names are deeply nostalgic. It is about design, legal design, strategic design, the design of a second life for intangible assets.
Because companies have business cycles, but rights, when structured intelligently, can have survival strategies. Before we begin, a quick note. This episode was prepared with the assistance of artificial intelligence. My voice in this format is AI cloned, and Artemisa is a fully AI co-host. This episode is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice.
We are here for insight, not for forming an attorney-client relationship with your old phone.
Let's begin with BlackBerry because it is the easiest illusion to break.
For many people, BlackBerry is a completed story. Rise, dominance, decline. A device that once defined professional life and then quietly disappeared from pockets.
But legally, that is only the first chapter. What happened next is far more interesting. BlackBerry reorganized its intellectual property into something that could function independently from the original product. It transferred roughly 32,000 non core patents into a monetization structure, but kept what it still needed to operate, retained its most strategic patents, and built in a continuing economic interest through profit based royalties.
So instead of treating patents as historical artifacts, they treated them as active assets with a future.
Yes, and that future was not left to chance. The transaction combined immediate liquidity with a long tail of potential earnings. The royalties were structured as a share of downstream profits with escalation tiers and caps and even cost controls to prevent the buyer from diluting the royalty base. This is a very deliberate design choice. It reflects a recognition that valuation of a patent portfolio is inherently uncertain. Rather than arguing endlessly over price, the parties share the upside.
A negotiation solution disguised as a financial structure.
And a very effective one. What makes this even more compelling is that the portfolio did not go dormant. It moved into a specialist environment. In 2026, patents originating from that ecosystem are being asserted in litigation against companies like Brother, targeting technologies that are still embedded in everyday devices, wireless connectivity, secure communication, interface design. There is also a subtle historical layering here. Some of the asserted patents trace back to earlier ecosystems, including Nortel and QNX. So, what we are seeing is not a single company's legacy, but a convergence of multiple technological lineages continuing under new ownership.
So the BlackBerry brand stepped back, but the underlying technology kept circulating almost like it changed identity and kept working.
That is a good way to see it. BlackBerry teaches us that IP does not need to stay attached to the original business model. It can be separated, reallocated, and given a new operational life. The key is structure.
Now Nokia feels different, less dramatic, more persistent.
Nokia did not experience a single defining collapse. It experienced a gradual shift. The handset era faded, but Nokia repositioned itself around network infrastructure and intellectual property licensing. And this is where the nature of IP changes. Some patents are tied to products, others are tied to systems. Nokia's portfolio, especially in telecommunications, sits inside global standards. That changes everything.
Because if your patent is part of the standard, you are no longer competing for attention. You are embedded in necessity.
Standards, essential patents carry obligations, particularly FRAND commitments, but they also create continuity. As long as the standard is used, the underlying patents remain relevant. Nokia also engaged in transactions where portions of its portfolio were transferred to specialized entities with revenue sharing arrangements that allowed Nokia to retain economic participation while shifting enforcement and commercialization responsibilities.
So instead of building and selling phones, Nokia began collecting value from the invisible layer that makes phones work.
This is not about survival after failure. This is about repositioning value. The intellectual property becomes less visible to consumers, but more stable as a source of revenue.
Ericsson takes that idea further and gives it structure. Ericsson does not just participate in licensing, it operationalizes it.
That is the difference. In one of the key transactions, Ericsson transferred thousands of patents to Unwired Planet, but retained a share in the future revenue generated by those patents. The structure included a tiered revenue share that increased as cumulative revenue grew, along with protections tied to performance and change of control. This creates a layered relationship. Ownership shifts, economic interest remains, incentives align.
And the more successful the enforcement and licensing, the more the original owner benefits.
Yes, but there is an important constraint. These patents are tied to standards. That means FRAND commitments apply. The buyer cannot simply pursue aggressive licensing without regard for fairness and accessibility. The legal framework continues to shape behavior.
So even in the afterlife, the patents are not free agents. They carry obligations with them.
Erickson shows that IP can function as a disciplined, recurring business activity governed by contractual obligations, regulatory expectations, and market norms. This is a mature form of IP afterlife, structured, predictable, and integrated into long-term strategy.
Intangiblia, the podcast of intangible law, plain talk about intellectual property.
And then we reach Nortel, where everything becomes more dramatic.
Yes, Nortel is the moment where the illusion disappears completely.
The company collapsed. The operating business could not be sustained. But when the assets were examined, the patent portfolio stood out as extraordinarily valuable.
It was auctioned for approximately $4.5 billion.
Which tells you everything you need to know about where the value really was.
This is IP as residual value. In bankruptcy, intellectual property can become the most important asset in the estate. It can attract bidders, support creditor recoveries, and shape the outcome of restructuring. And once transferred, those patents did not sit quietly. They were deployed by new owners, licensed, enforced, integrated into broader strategies.
So the company disappeared, but the patents became more active than ever.
Nortel teaches a very direct lesson. Intellectual property can preserve value even when the business fails. It can survive liquidation, change ownership, and continue to generate economic activity.
Kodak adds a different layer.
It is not just about failure, it is about timing. Kodak was a pioneer in digital imaging. It developed early digital camera technology and built a significant patent portfolio, but it struggled to translate that into sustained commercial leadership.
So the innovation was there. The market execution was more complicated.
When Kodak entered Chapter 11 in 2012, it turned to its intellectual property as a source of liquidity. But instead of a simple sale, it built a complex transaction.
It assigned a large portfolio of digital imaging patents to a buyer entity. At the same time, it granted licenses to a consortium of major technology companies.
It secured license-backed rights to continue operating. It settled ongoing litigation. It negotiated standstill agreements to prevent immediate future disputes. The total proceeds were around $525 to $530 million, which were used in part to repay debtor-in-possession financing and support restructuring. So the patents became both a financial resource and a legal reset. Earlier estimates of the portfolio's value were significantly higher. The final outcome was shaped by litigation risks, title disputes, and the pressures of bankruptcy.
So the value was real, but the timing affected how much of it could be captured.
Kodak shows that intellectual property can carry value beyond commercial decline, but that value is sensitive to context. Legal clarity, timing, and negotiation dynamics all influence the outcome. Still, even in a difficult scenario, IP provided liquidity, strategic flexibility, and a path forward.
And then we arrive at Technicolor, where everything becomes more engineered.
Technicolor sold its patent licensing business to Interdigital for an upfront cash payment, but retained a significant share of future revenues, around 42.5% of certain licensing receipts. It also secured a perpetual license back, so the company monetized immediately while remaining economically connected to the future performance of the portfolio.
This is where IP starts behaving like a financial instrument.
The transaction separates ownership, operation, and economic participation. It allows the buyer to manage licensing and enforcement, while the seller continues to benefit from success. It also introduces accounting complexity because contingent revenue streams are uncertain and recognized over time.
So the value exists, but it unfolds gradually based on performance.
Technicolor shows that IP Afterlife can be deliberately designed. It can be structured to balance liquidity, risk, and long-term participation. Looking across these 6 cases, what stands out is not a single pattern, but a set of strategies. BlackBerry restructures, Nokia repositions, Ericsson systematizes, Nortel liquidates, Kodak converts under pressure, Technicolor engineers.
Different stories, same outcome, the rights continue.
And that is the real answer to our question. Not just whether IP can outlive the business that created it, but how many different ways it can do so. So, can IP outlive the business that created it? After everything we have seen, the answer is yes. But the more interesting answer is how. Because what these 6 stories show is that intellectual property does not survive by accident. It survives by design, by legal choices, by timing, by structure, and sometimes by necessity. BlackBerry shows us that a company can pivot and deliberately give part of its portfolio a second life, with shared upside and retained control where it matters. Nokia shows that IP can move from products into infrastructure, becoming part of systems that continue long after consumer trends change. Ericsson shows that licensing can become a disciplined, recurring business shaped by rules like FRAND and long-term strategy. Nortel shows that even in collapse, IP can hold extraordinary value and become the centerpiece of recovery. Kodak shows that innovation can be monetized later, even if commercial success came earlier or somewhere else, though timing and pressure will shape the outcome. Technicolor shows that IP can be structured almost like a financial asset, balancing immediate liquidity with future participation.
6 companies, 6 different endings, one common thread. The rights did not disappear.
And that leads us to a few clear takeaways. First, intellectual property is not only about protecting the present, it is also about preserving future options. A well-structured portfolio can remain valuable even if the original business model changes.
Second, separation matters. The product, the company, and the IP are connected, but they are not the same thing. When you recognize that, you gain flexibility. You can sell, license, retain, or restructure each layer differently.
Third, timing and legal clarity shape value. Kodak reminds us that even strong portfolios can lose value under pressure, especially when litigation, title issues, or financial constraints are involved.
Fourth, structure creates continuity. Licensing programs, revenue sharing models, grant back rights, and standards frameworks all allow IP to keep generating value across transitions.
And finally, IP is not static. It can move, adapt, and evolve. It can shift from protection to monetization, from product support to infrastructure, from ownership to participation. So the real strategy is not just to build something valuable. It is to make sure that value knows how to survive change. Because innovation does not end when a product leaves the market. In many cases, that is when its legal and economic story begins to change. Thank you for joining us on Intangiblia. We hope this episode gave you a new perspective on what happens after the spotlight fades and how intellectual property can continue working long after the original business evolves or even disappears.
Think of it this way. Products retire, companies pivot, markets move on. But a well-structured portfolio, that stays busy.
And that is the question we will leave you with today. If your business changed tomorrow, would your intellectual property still be creating value?
Or would it retire with the product?
Until next time, keep building, keep protecting, and keep thinking strategically about what your ideas can become over time.
Because the best ideas do not just succeed.
They endure. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to Intangiblia, the podcast of intangible law, plain talk about intellectual property. Did you like what we talked today? Please share with your network. Do you want to learn more about intellectual property? Subscribe now on your favorite podcast player. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Visit our website www.intangiblia.com. Copyright Leticia Caminero 2020. All rights reserved. This podcast is provided for information purposes only.